Back in those days, it was fruit farming, apples, grapes, and strawberries, and cattle. We had it all. Running errands, chasing cows, helping milk, hoeing strawberries, you name it. I got some of it. I started working on the farm probably when I was about 5 or 6 years old, just doing chores. And then as he came along, I did more and more, took over the tractor driving and did it all again. We had about an 80-acre farm, and it was located in the Little Elm community, or Bethel Grove community, it's sort of interchangeable there, right directly across from the Little Elm Baptist Church. I think that's still there. Oh, anything that would make a buck, I hauled hay for people. As I got a little older, I did tractor work for them. Before that, I would do work with a team of horses for them. My earliest memory, one that really sticks in my mind, would be coming through Farmington, and it was between World War I and II. Things were tough back then. People were hungry. And right directly across 62 from the old high school was a big tract of land that ran almost back to where they're building the new Farmington High School. And that belonged, or it was leased, or at least it was leased to, I don't know what the ownership was, to a big company Stark's Nursery. They were a national company. And they raised all kinds of plants, trees, you name it. And I can remember coming by there, and it looked like there was 1,000 people out there working in that field. But I'm sure there was 40 or 50 or so, but everybody was looking for work. And that kept Farmington from just drying up. Well, it was important in that it saved Farmington, but it was an important business. They shipped plants and stuff all over the United States. I do recall one gentleman's name, Hobo Hickman. He lived directly across from Stark's Nursery, and I think he worked for them for a long time. Well, there was McNeil's grocery store, old grocery store there, directly across from the courthouse at that time. The post office at that time. And that's about the only business I recall at that time. Now, a little later on, they got another grocery store up the street a little ways. But you went through Farmington just real quick. There wasn't much there. Okay, I started the school at Bethel Grove, which was a little country school, 1 through 8 grades. And I finished the 8th grade, and then I went to Farmington. And I did my first 2 years in Farmington. I rode the school bus then. Those little stores outside back earlier didn't have school buses, so that's why there were so many little school around. People had to walk if they went to school or ride a bicycle. But that's as far as I can remember back on that particular school. Now, when I got to Farmington, I went through the 9th and 10th grades. And my parents, particularly my mother, was a big advocate of me finishing the university. So we found out that the agricultural school at the university required you to have chemistry and that sort of, and 2 or 3 more programs that Farmington didn't provide. One of the teachers at Fayetteville lived down the road from us, so I would ride with her every morning and come home with her at night. And I finished my last 2 years of high school at Fayetteville and got those courses that I needed to go to college. I made it through college in 4 years, and then I went into the Army. Oh, some of the Mahlon girls that lived out west of Farmington. Probably my best friend in school and still is at that point was Jimmy Reef. He lived right in Farmington. He turned out to be a very successful businessman and lives up at Rogers now, retired. Yeah, Mr. and Fred Starr and his wife both taught there at that time when I was in Farmington. I think he was the principal at that point in time. Farmington had a good school at that time. Well, they always said if you come up with a baseball glove, a 22 pistol and a bicycle, you'd made it. And we didn't get the pistol quite that early, the rifle quite that early, but we'd get on our bicycles. We played baseball. We'd ride to the Illinois River down there and swim, and I had a pretty good bunch of ponies at that time, and I say 4 or 5 ponies, and we'd get those ponies saddled up and all take a ride. Pop Williams, I don't know if you know Pop. Pop Williams, he wasn't related to me, but every Sunday afternoon he had a donkey named Patches. I do remember that. 3 or 4 of us would go over and try to ride Pop's donkey. We never could make it. If he couldn't throw us off, he'd just lay down on the front end and spill us off. But that's one thing. I don't know why that particularly stuck with me, but it has. Well, the Cunninghams lived right across the street from me, of course. Tony's down at Prairie Grove now, and his mother. The Dormans, Shipleys lived close to us, Norman Shipley and his family. And oh gosh, there were lots of kids. They lived around us there. I think the street was still gravel back with my first memories, and it straightened out. It didn't follow the route that it's on now exactly. It went out about where just east of Farmington School, and it turned left. It made a 90-degree left, and it went down there about a 1/4 mile and made a 90-degree right. And but back in those days, they followed the property lines. They didn't take people's property. They just kind of ran the road how it had to be run to not go through somebody's place. But I don't recall when they paved that road, but it was. I can recall when a lot of it was still gravel. Well, you had some Broyles people that lived there. This Reef family lived there. McNeil's had the grocery store, and then DeLance Phillips added the grocery store out on east a little further. They'd visit. I can remember about every Sunday afternoon you'd go to somebody's house and the kids would play and the parents would visit. My dad was, a lot of men back then were big quail hunters. A lot of them would go quail hunting. The women they had a lot of quilting bees back then. I can remember that from a youngster. The women would get together and visit. There wasn't a whole lot to do. You just made your own own enjoyment out there. To the Bethel Grove Church, and it was 3/4 mile due west of the Little Elm Baptist Church. That's an interesting point. That church was it was a Presbyterian church right near where the grade school was. And sometime, I don't recall exactly, but probably in the 50s, they moved that church to Prairie Grove, and it made it part of the Presbyterian church that's in Prairie Grove now. Part of that building is the old church building from Bethel Grove. And how they moved that thing that far without tearing it down, I don't remember. Times were a lot slower. You made your own enjoyment. Nobody had any money back then to speak of. I mean, if you could come up with just a little money, you were a wealthy man. I don't know of a millionaire back then, unless it might have been Jones Truck Lines. But times were tough, and the boys, we'd get together and play baseball and whatever we had to do. Go fishing, go hunting. The girls, they did what they did. But you didn't go to the movie. Very seldom you made it to a movie, but after we got bigger in high school and college, things changed. But as a real youngster, there wasn't a whole lot to do unless you made it yourself. I graduated at the university with a degree in agriculture. I had some offers from 2 or 3 big feed companies then. I wasn't interested in really going that route, so I went back to the farm at that time and farmed, raised cattle, and it's still back in the same community. Then I was called into the service. I went in and did my time in the service, and when I came out, we had a pretty good poultry operation as well as cattle when I went into the service. When I came out, the poultry people began to tell me that you're either going to have to get big or get out of the chicken business. And we had about 20,000 capacity that time. That was pretty good at that time, but it was small in today's numbers. So I decided that might be time to make a change. And I had an offer from a real estate agent that wanted me to go to work for him. So I thought, well, I'll give that a try. In this period of time, my wife and I had gotten married. I went into the real estate business and worked in it about 2 years and opened my own business. And the real estate business was good to me. It really was. Things were on the move. I dealt primarily in rural property, and very few people were in that business. They were all selling houses in town. I was very fortunate. I made some contacts with some California, Arizona people that came back and bought a lot of land, and I was doing pretty good. Then I got reactivated in the service, called up in the reserve. So I went into that for a year. That didn't help my real estate business any, although I had two people running it for me. But Rex Perkins, who was a pretty well-known attorney here in Fayetteville, was a big friend of my dad's. They did a lot of hunting together, and he always told me, he said, when you grow up, I want you to go to law school and be my partner. And the more I got to thinking about that, I thought maybe he had something. So I sold the real estate business, and I went into law school. And Rex helped me get in there and paid some of the freight for me to get in there. I started in January of that year. Rex died I started in January that year. Rex died in November of that year. So there I was. That didn't work. But anyway, I went up and finished law school. Got out of law school, went to work for Walter Niblock, and worked about a year and a half from him, and I enjoyed it, but I knew right then I was never going to be a good pencil-pushing lawyer. I didn't like that type of law. Several of the attorneys in town got after me and agreed to support me if I'd run for prosecuting attorney. And I believe it was in '61 that I decided to run for prosecuting attorney. And with the help of a bunch of lawyers, I got elected. And I served there for 8 years. And then I decided to run for circuit judge. Judge Cummings was retiring at that time. And I won that, and I served there for another 12 years. So I put 20 years in there, either as a prosecutor or a judge. Then I got out. I'd got my retirement time in. I got out and practiced law for W.H. Taylor and some of those boys for a while, primarily W.H. And then I just decided I'd retire. I always had a little land and cattle all the way through it after I was about 12, 14 years old. And so I went back and I bought a farm and ran cattle on it. And then the highway came by, and where the women's hospital is now, that was my last piece of real estate, and I sold that and retired. I don't know who owns the old homestead now. I'm not sure the house is even there. I know the chicken houses are gone, and I think there's an old barn. I went by there about 2 or 3 years ago going to Prairie Grove for something, but that country's all changed. The one place out there that hasn't changed much is Joyce Cunningham's. It's just about like it was. Of course, at one time, they raised a lot of chickens, a big grape vineyard. Great people, good neighbors, good neighbors. Of course, Joyce's husband, Tony's father, was captured in World War II, and he was gone for quite a while. And then, but he came back. He was in a prison camp, and he came. Everyone thought that he was gone, and he just showed up one day, got back. But the Cunninghams were good neighbors. Joyce is still a good neighbor out there, I'm sure, to everybody around her. She'll do anything to help you. And Tony's in Prairie Grove. I think he was in the real estate business the insurance business for quite some time. What I noticed is, I guess, what you just couldn't miss, and that's all the building that's going on, particularly residential stuff. We have 2 daughters, and both of them live in Farmington. They build homes out there, and the building's just gone wild. Of course, it's going that way everywhere. I remember A.C. Williams was the baler man for that community. He always had a tractor and a baler. He baled about all the hay that was baled. And I would follow along A.C. and get a job hauling the hay in for the people and putting it in the barn. And that was hot work, but my dad had an old truck he would let me have, and I would take that truck and get me a couple friends to help me, and we'd haul hay most all summer. I did tractor work for people. Well, there were a lot of grapes in that country growing at that time, and it got to where grapes had to be sprayed quite a lot. And my dad had a power takeoff sprayer, and I would farm out with that when he wouldn't use it and spray grapes for people. That was pretty good money back then. But you just did what you could find to do. I bought a little piece of land. This is kind of interesting to me, may not anyone else, but a piece of land came up for sale, and I believe there was 20 acres of it. There was 20 acres of it, and they wanted $600 for it. Now, this was early on. And my dad told me, he said, "You're going to buy that land." And I said, "Dad, I don't have any money." I think I was 10 years old. And he said, "Yeah, you will. We'll go to the bank. You're going to borrow the money you need to buy it." So I went to the bank. Delford Reef, who of course was a friend of my dad's, he loaned me the money. And I sat there and I thought, I'll go to jail. I'll never pay this back. They'll put me in jail. Anyway, Delford, I was paying it, I don't know, like $10 a month or something. I worked on that property. And and every time I'd get 50 cents or $1 and was in Prairie Grove, I'd put down on that payment. And about 2 years into it, my dad knew what he was doing. He told me, he said, "Son, I need to lease a little land. I'm getting too many cows. I need a little land if you hear of any." And so I said, "Hey, I got some." And I leased him the land, and that paid for it eventually. But I kept that for years and years and years, and I didn't sell it till a few years ago. But that $600 that I paid on that turned into about $42,000. And I thought, man, if I had had the wherewithal and the guidance to have bought a lot of land, you could own the whole country. But that's how times changed, and they changed fast. I learned to never tell a lie, and I learned I learned to be honest with people, and I learned to work hard, and never complain about it, and go on, do your work, and do the best you can. Now, my mother, my dad didn't have any education. I think maybe an 8th grade education. He had to drop out of school and help raise the family. You know how that went back then. And my mother had, I think, 2 semesters of college. And she helped me a lot in that respect. She's the one that really pushed me into getting an education. But, and I've never regretted it. Well, Gibson Hill is a very steep hill. It goes down through Maury Hill's farm, or land that he uses. My 2 great uncles by the name of Gibson, Bill and Bob Gibson, lived right at the base of Gibson Hill. That was named after them. And everybody always thought Gibson Hill was the biggest obstacle they'd ever seen in this land. Now it wouldn't amount to much, but if you trying to think how you would find it easiest, but if you're familiar with that part of the country at all, it crosses Goose Creek right at the bottom of Gibson Hill, and then it turns a T and turn left, go down to Maury Hills, turn right to come back into Farmington. But that kind of a funny story about Gibson Hill. We were teenagers then, and a couple of boys Junior Allen and Ronnie Allen, both of them lived in Prairie Grove at that time. We were all kind of grew up together. Junior was a little older than us. Junior came up with a old an old touring car, and the steering wheel would come off of it. Junior had me in the rumble seat one time, and his brother Ronnie was up front with him, and we were going down Gibson Hill, and him and his brother got into some kind of a fuss up there in front, and Ronnie or Junior just pulled the steering wheel off and handed it to Ronnie and said, "Here, you drive if you don't like the way I'm driving." That thing went on. If it hadn't have turned and got over into the ditch and the brush, we'd have all died at the bottom of Gibson Hill. No steering on it at all. But that's what I really remember about Gibson Hill. But that was sort of a famous place, Gibson Hill. That was people talked about that. Today it wouldn't amount to anything. I can't remember the exact dates that we got electricity, but before we got it, of course, you had an old well with a bucket and a rope. You drew all your water with it. All your heat was electricity. My mama cooked with an old wood cook stove. It was just tough compared to what it is today. My most really memory of electricity is sitting in the kitchen one day, and I looked up, and back then it was just covered with flies coming down that old green cord that hung your light on. You didn't have lights like this. All the lights you had would just be dropped out of the ceiling and screwed into a bulb receptor. And it was all those old green cords, and the flies would just congregate on those cords. Now that's sort of a strange thing to remember, but that's what I remember about electricity, the first hours that I really had. But it changed things. I can remember drawing that water for horses and cows and chickens and house and everything else out of that old bucket. And then I remember when we got electricity, we hooked it up, and one of the first things that happened, it stalled one day, and my mother went out to start the engine. She laid her hand on the top of that to give it a little boost, and it boosted, but it cut her finger off at the first joint. She come running into the house, and boy, blood was flying everywhere, and she told me to get my dad. Well, he was about half a mile up the road doing something. So I jump on my bicycle, run up the road and get him, come back, and she goes to the doctor. Dr. Baggett there in Prairie Grove. I'm sure I don't know how he stopped it, but he fixed my mother's finger up. But that was a big deal. Just a matter of time, you could get, you could get TV and radio. Before we got electricity, World War II was going, and I can remember, this is a strange memory to have, but I can remember sitting there by an old battery-powered radio, and Gabriel Heater was an old news reporter at that time. And I can remember that voice. He'd come on and say, "Things are bad in the home front tonight." He always started off with things were bad till it got about to the end, then he changed and things were good. But electricity was a big change. All the milking was by hand, no help from that. Oh, it was a savior for them. You could get electricity. You had electric washers, or everything went to electricity. They went to it kind of slowly because people they didn't have the money at that time to go out and build a house and put all the electrical appliances in. But you get I think we got a refrigerator and a cook stove and a water pump, the first three things I can remember. But I tell you, all mothers had it tough back then. They had it tough. Trying to keep a family fed. And, boy, I've split enough wood on an old axe to keep that cook stove burning, and I don't see how in the world they ever cooked on it, but she did. You bet, I used a crosscut saw. If the guy on the other end wanted to, he could make it tough on you, or he could make it easy. He could do most of the work, but every once in a while they'd get real funny and want to hang it up on you and let you get it out. But crosscut was work. Everything back then was oak lumber, green oak. It was none of it cured. You cut it down with a crosscut and did the best you can, and drove it by hand and hammer with nails. We always milked about 10 or 12 cows too, and electricity helped that. We got electric milkers, and that was a big deal, big help. I can remember sitting there milking those old cows hot, and they'd want to kick every once in a while and stick their foot in the bucket. That gets to another subject. I don't know how people survived drinking milk back in those days. You'd go out there and milk those old cows, and Pet Milk Company would run a route, and you'd put your can of milk in a tub of water out by the road. They'd come by and pick it up. It might be hopefully it was the same day you put it out there, but I don't know what that milk looked like at the other end. But about all the strainer did for you before you put it in the bucket, it just kind of took the straw and the manure out. I don't think it done anything else. 20,000 chickens. That was when I was in college. Yeah. Well, it was when I got to the university. It was about it was in the early 1960s when we had the 20,000 chickens. But we did have an electric feeder at that time. We got one just right after it came in, and of course those were a lot of. They had some problems with them, but it was sure a lot better than feeding them by hand. And now, I remember feeding all those chickens, and that guy coming out and talking. My dad died early, about in 1957, I believe. And anyway, I was taking care of all that at that point. And my dad came out. I mean, the man with the poultry company came out, and he said, "Son, I want to give you a tip." He said, "They're getting ready to enlarge the poultry business. Tyson and all of them going to get big. And you're going to have to, instead of raising 20,000 chickens, you're going to have to think about 100,000, 200,000 chickens." And he says it's going to be a big investment building those houses and equipping them. He said, "Be sure you know what you want to do before you jump into it." And that was Paul Martin. In fact, he had a store. He had a feed store in Prairie Grove at one time. But he probably kept me out of business, out of trouble by doing that, because that's the way the poultry business has gone. You're either big or you stay out. You'll see a lot of old chicken houses sitting around now, empty and falling down because they couldn't keep up anymore, and they just there. I'd tell them it was a nice area. It had potential, but it wasn't big enough for everybody to be big. You know, there was just, it was really, that part of the county was really, it was the smooth part of Washington County. You go most any direction except up north a little bit around Springdale, Tawnytown. It's pretty rugged country. It's not good farming country. And that was the premier country for any kind of fruit that was grown back then, as well as chickens, because it had good road systems to it. And there was good people out there. We just never had any trouble with people. It taught me how to work. It taught me how to grow up and hopefully be an honest person. And it taught me I needed to get an education and try to make something out of myself. I think the first time he taught me that, he paddled my tail real well because he caught me lying to him about something. But my dad was a religious man. I mean, he wasn't a radical. He was just a good man. My mother was too. And they just always impressed on me that the necessity of being honest. He always told me, he said, "You tell a lie, and you're going to have to tell 2 or 3 more to cover it up before it's over." And he said, "The word will get out." And he says, "Your reputation is going to be the strongest asset you have. It's the hardest to make and the easiest to lose." I wrote that down somewhere. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. That's all I can think of. It's been a good ride. I think I had a good place to start right out there with those people. They took care of me, and I tried to help them when I could. And I wouldn't do it again any different.